The morning light came in soft and gold, the way it always did on Mother's Day. Slipping between the lace curtains, I had hemmed myself the year David turned 7. Before I tell you what happened that day, let me tell you who my son is, because everything that came after only makes sense if you understand who he was to me. David is my only child, the boy I carried through a Texas summer. So hot the doctor warned me to stay indoors, the baby who came into the world screaming with lungs strong enough to drown out the thunderstorm outside the hospital window. He was golden-haired and fearless, the child who learned to walk by letting go of my finger and running straight into his father's arms, the little boy who once told me at the age of 5 that when he grew up he would buy me a castle, so I would never have to wash another dish. I laughed then and kissed the top of his curly head and told him all I ever wanted was for him to be happy and kind. He kept the kindness longer than most. He kept the happiness too, until the world taught him that money could buy both in larger quantities than love ever provided. Today, David is 38 years old, a millionaire many times over, the owner of a string of tech companies whose names appear on glowing screens in offices I will never enter. He drives a car that costs more than the house he grew up in, lives in a mansion with gates that open by themselves, and employs people whose only job is to make sure he is never uncomfortable. The newspapers call him a visionary. Strangers ask for his autograph. Women who once ignored the skinny boy in hand-me-down jeans now smile at him in a way that makes my chest ache with memories. But to me, he is still the boy who cried when the stray dog he fed got hit by a truck, who saved his allowance for 6 months to buy me a tiny gold locket on my 40th birthday, who fell asleep on my lap during church when he was too big to fit, but too heartbroken over his father's death to let go. That is my son. That is the man who stepped onto my porch on Mother's Day morning carrying roses so red they hurt the eyes, kiss my cheek with the brief, careful kiss of someone whose time is measured in dollars per minute, and asked the question that would tear 8 months of careful pretending wide open. Mom, Clara still sends you the $5,000 every month, right? I just want to make sure you're comfortable. The pie fork slipped from my fingers and rang against the counter like a small bell announcing the end of something I had not even known was dying. $5,000. 8 months. $40,000. The numbers floated in front of my eyes while the roses bled their perfect scent into the room. I felt the blood leave my face, felt the old floorboards tilt beneath my feet, felt the exact moment they lie I had been living to protect, my golden-haired, castle-promising little boy, cracked straight down the middle. I had been living on church parcels and pride. I had been smiling at neighbors while counting how many more days a single can of beans could be stretched. I had been thanking God for every dented tin of soup as though it were manna. And all this time my only child, my brilliant, successful, castle-building son, believed I was comfortable. The rest of the morning unfolded in slow, terrible detail. The way his smile died, the way Clara walked in wearing silk, the color of pearls and perfume that cost more per ounce than my monthly light bill, the way she smiled that dazzling, practiced smile while her eyes stayed winter cold. I felt every second of it in my bones, in my stomach, in the sudden ache behind my eyes that warned tears were waiting if I let them. But I did not cry. Not then. Mothers learn early how to swallow oceans. That night, after they left, I sat in the quiet house with the roses watching me like witnesses and opened the brown leather notebook David had given me years ago for grocery lists and prayer requests. The first page was still blank. I wrote 2 lines in handwriting that did not shake. Find the truth. Never trust fake tears. And with those words, the mother of the boy, who once promised me a castle, began, very quietly, to change. The next morning came in pale and merciless, the way mornings do when the night has left bruises on the soul. I woke before the rooster down the road had even thought about crowing. The house still wrapped in that particular hush that belongs only to old widows and broken promises. The roses David had brought sat on the table like silent witnesses, their petals already beginning to loosen, a few red tears on the oilcloth. I looked at them for a long time, feeling the weight of what had happened the day before settle into every bone. I did not make coffee. I did not water the lavender. I dressed in the same navy skirt and white blouse I wore to funerals and court dates that never came, pinned my gray hair into the neat bun I had, worn since 1972, and took the small passbook from the drawer where I kept the important things, Frank's death certificate, David's first baby tooth, in a tiny envelope, the last grocery list my husband ever wrote. The passbook was soft. From years of handling, its cover faded to the color of weak tea. Inside were the careful records of a lifetime of small deposits and smaller withdrawals. I slipped it into my purse, the one with the broken clasp I kept meaning to fix, and walked the 1.5 miles to First Texas Community Bank before the sun had fully cleared the oak trees. The sidewalk was still cool under my sensible shoes, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and distant rain that would never quite arrive. I passed Mrs. Delgado watering her roses, Mr. Jenkins walking his ancient beagle, the same faces that had watched David grow from scraped knees to boardrooms. They waved, smiled their gentle, pitying smiles, reserved for widows who still walked to town because they had no one to drive them. I nodded back, chin high, because pride was one of the few things no one had managed to steal yet. At the bank, the air conditioning hit me like a slap, raising goose flesh on my arms. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and old money. Molly, the young teller who always called me ma'am, even though we had known each other since she was in pigtails, looked up from her window and smiled the bright, professional smile they teach in training videos. I placed the passbook on the counter between us, like an offering. "Molly, honey," I said, keeping my voice steady, the way mothers do when they are holding back oceans, "could you check something for me? My son David says he's been sending $5,000 every month for the past 8 months. I just want to make sure it's getting to the right place." She took the passbook with the reverence young people still show for anything on paper, opened it, typed my account number into her computer. I watched her face change. The smile softened into something gentler, sadder. She typed again, slower this time, as if the keys themselves were heavy. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, leaning close so the security guard wouldn't hear. "There's nothing, not a single transfer from David Hayes. The only deposit this year was $1.35 interest back in February." I stood there while the lobby spun slowly around me, the way the world spins when you realize the ground you thought was solid has been hollow all along. $40,000. $40,000 that had never existed for me, not even as numbers on a page. I thanked Molly, took back the passbook that now felt like evidence, and walked out into the heat that had already begun to shimmer off the asphalt. The walk home was longer than the walk there, each step measured against the pounding in my chest. By the time I reached the porch, my legs were trembling but not from tiredness, from the size of what had been taken, and from the size of what I now had to do. I sat in Frank's old rocking chair, the one that creaked in all the same places it had creaked for 40 years, and let myself feel it all. The betrayal was a living thing inside me, coiled and hissing. Not just Clara's betrayal, though that was sharp enough, but the deeper one. The years I had spent teaching my son to be good, to be grateful, to protect the weak. And somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing his own mother as someone who still needed protecting. I thought of all the small humiliations I had swallowed to spare him worry. The nights I ate plain rice because meat was too dear. The winter I wore Frank's old coat with the torn lining because a new one felt like greed. The way I smiled at church when they asked how David was doing and said, "Blessed beyond measure," while my own pantry held 3 cans of soup and half a box of saltines. I rocked slowly, the chair singing its familiar, creaking song, and felt the storm gather. Not the loud kind with thunder and lightning, but the quiet kind that levels houses from the inside out. The kind only mothers know how to carry. That afternoon, I took out the brown leather notebook again. The first page still held yesterday's 2 lines. I turned to a fresh page and began to write with the same careful handwriting I had used when I balanced the church books for 30 years. Thursday, June 14th, Clara arrived at 2:17 p.m. with a store-bought cake. Said the money was sent, maybe delayed at the bank. No envelope produced. Wore diamond earrings the size of dimes. Saturday, July 12th, phone call at 6:42 p.m. Background noise sounded like restaurant. Music and laughter. Claimed she couldn't visit because of a charity gala. Friday, August 22nd, pulled up in brand new silver Lexus with temporary plates. Brought grocery store lavender. Said stress was bad for the memory. When confronted, smile flickered for half a second. Fidgeted with necklace. Left after only 11 minutes. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the light slanted golden across the page, and the crickets began their evening chorus. I wrote every visit, every phone call, every gift that came without an envelope, every lie dressed up as kindness. I wrote the way surgeons cut, clean and precise, because anger left to fester becomes poison, and I had no intention of dying from this. When the page was full, I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest the way I once pressed David when he had nightmares. The house was quiet. The roses had begun to drop petals like blood, and somewhere in the silence, I felt Frank sitting beside me the way he used to when the world got too heavy. I was no longer just a mother waiting for her son to remember her. I was Margaret Hayes, 67 years old, and I had work to do. The morning that changed everything arrived wrapped in ordinary September heat, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the gravel and turns the lavender leaves silver at the edges. I was on my knees in the garden, hands deep in the warm earth, cutting stems for the bundles I sold at the church market on Saturdays, when the sound of a car that did not belong on my road drifted over the cicadas. It was not the low electric purr of David's Tesla, nor the smug growl of Clara's Lexus. This was quieter, more deliberate, the sound of a man who had driven a long way with something heavy on his mind. I stood slowly, knees protesting the way they had begun to protest every movement since 65, and wiped my hands on the apron that had once been Frank's shirt. A charcoal gray sedan sat in my driveway, clean despite the dust, the kind of car government men and accountants drive when they do not want to be noticed. The driver's door opened, and a tall stranger stepped out. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, suit, pressed, but slightly rumpled from hours behind the wheel. He carried a leather briefcase the color of strong coffee and looked at my little house the way people look at places where truths are about to be born or buried. He walked toward me with the careful steps of someone who has delivered bad news before and knows there is no gentle way to do it. When he reached the bottom porch step, he removed his hat. Actually, removed it the way men used to, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried, like church bells. Mrs. Margaret Hayes. I felt the lavender stem snap in my fingers. No, one who knew me called me Margaret except bill collectors and strangers with folders. I nodded once. My name is Bennett Lang. I'm the chief accountant at Hayes and Partners. He paused, letting the weight of the company name settle between us like dust. Your son's company. May I come inside? What I have to show you should not be discussed in the open air. I led him through the screen door that still creaked in the same two places it had creaked since 1983. The house smelled of coffee and dried lavender and the faint ghost of yesterday's apple pie. I did not offer him a seat at the kitchen table right away. Mothers learn to measure men before they invite them to sit where their children once did homework. He stood patiently while I studied him. There were lines around his eyes that came from long nights and longer consciences. His hands were clean, but the knuckles showed the scars of a man who had once worked with them. I decided I could trust the scars. I pulled out Frank's old chair, the one with the worn arms where David used to fall asleep waiting for dinner, and gestured for him to sit. Then I took the chair opposite, folded my hands on the oilcloth, and waited the way mothers wait when they already know the news will hurt. He opened the briefcase and laid a thick manila folder on the table between us like a surgeon laying out instruments. The folder was heavier than it looked. He did not open it yet. Mrs. Hayes, he began, voice low, 3 days ago you called our accounting department from a pay phone at the post office. You asked Sandra Miller to confirm automated transfers of $5,000 a month. Sandra is my assistant. She came to me because something didn't feel right. I've spent the last 72 hours pulling every record I could find without raising alarms. What I discovered is ugly. He opened the folder. The first page was a bank statement dated 9 months ago. Sender, David Hayes' personal account. Amount, $5,000. Recipient, an account bearing the name Margaret Hayes. Account number unfamiliar. Routing, number unfamiliar. Everything unfamiliar except my name printed in crisp black. Ink like a signature on a death warrant. He turned the page. Another transfer. And another. 8 in total. $40,000. All landing in an account that was not mine. My breath left me the way breath leaves when you fall hard and unexpected. I felt the kitchen tilt, felt the lavender scent turn suddenly sour, felt the walls press in the way they had the morning Frank died. Bennett did not rush me. He simply waited, hands resting on the table like anchors. Page after page. Forged authorization forms, bearing David's hurried signature, signatures I recognized from birthday cards, and school permission slips. A photocopy of an ID with my name, but a photograph of me taken 20 years earlier, expertly altered. A sub-account agreement, linking the fraudulent account to Clara's personal debit card. And then the worst part, the spending records. Spa retreats in Houston, first-class flights to New York and Cancun for 2, jewelry purchases that made my wedding ring look like a child's toy, clothing, handbags, and the final knife, a $15,000 down payment on the silver Lexus I had watched pull away from my house 3 weeks ago while Clara smiled and said the money must have been left in the car. $47,800 in 8 months. All of it taken under my name while I counted pennies for bread. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. I felt the betrayal sink into my bones like winter cold, felt it settle in the place where pride used to live. This was not just theft. This was humiliation, dressed up as charity. This was my own son's trust turned into a weapon and aimed straight at the heart of the woman who had given him life. Bennett closed the folder gently, the way you close a coffin lid. David doesn't know, he said quietly. He signed the forms without reading them because he trusted her completely. He thinks you're living comfortably. He thinks he's taking care of you. I felt something inside me crack, wide open, something that had been holding me together since the day Frank's heart stopped. In the garden, the tears came then, silent and scalding, sliding down cheeks that had not known tears in years. Bennett pushed a clean handkerchief across the table. I took it, but did not wipe my face. I let them fall onto the oilcloth where they made small dark spots like blood. When the storm passed, I looked at him with eyes that were no longer soft. What happens now? I asked, and my voice did not shake. He met my gaze without flinching. That depends on you, Mrs. Hayes. I can walk out of here and pretend I never saw this, or I can help you build a case so airtight that not even the smoothest liar in Texas can wriggle out of it, but it will hurt your son. There's no way around that. I thought of David as a little boy, golden hair, and scraped knees, running to me with every hurt because he believed his mother could fix anything with a kiss and a cookie. I thought of the man he had become, tired eyes and expensive suits, believing he was doing right by me while his wife spent my survival on perfume and plane tickets. I folded Bennett's handkerchief neatly and placed it back on the table. Then we build the case. I said, but we build it quiet, and we build it strong. He nodded once, respect in his eyes for the first time. For the next 3 hours we sat at that table and planned like generals before a war no one else knew was coming. He showed me every document, every forged line, every receipt that carried Clara's fingerprints. I took notes in my brown leather notebook until the pages filled, and my hand cramped. When he left, the folder stayed behind, hidden beneath the loose floorboard under Frank's chair, where I once kept emergency cash and love. Letters. The sun was low and red when his car finally pulled away. I stood on the porch watching the dust settle and felt the change settle in me too. The woman who had answered the door that morning had been soft around the edges, still hoping her son would remember her without being asked. The woman who closed the door that evening was made of something harder. I went back inside, opened the notebook to a fresh page, and wrote a single line in letters that did not tremble. The fight begins today. The week that followed Bennett's visit passed in a hush so complete it felt as though the entire house was holding its breath with me. I moved through the days like a woman underwater, every motion slow and deliberate, every thought measured against the weight of what was coming. I watered the lavender at dawn, baked bread for the church sale, sat in the rocking chair at dusk with the folder hidden beneath the loose floorboard under Frank's chair, and felt the storm building behind my ribs, quiet, patient, unstoppable. I did not call David. I did not send a single text. Mothers know that some truths must walk into the light on their own legs. Instead, I waited, and in the waiting I prepared. On Thursday, I drove the old Ford to the market, the one Frank had taught David to drive in when he was 14 and all, knees and elbows, and bought the ingredients for the meal I knew would break. Everything open. Honey glazed ham, because it was David's favorite since he was 8 and had declared it better than birthday cake. Red potatoes for mashing, with real butter and cream, because Clara always pretended to watch her figure, but could never resist seconds. Fresh green beans from Mrs. Delgado's garden, crisp and bright as hope used to be. And for dessert, the cinnamon apple walnut. Pie that took 3 hours, and every ounce of love I still had left to give. I cleaned the house the way I cleaned it before. David's wedding, on my hands and knees with Murphy's oil soap until the wood. Floors gleamed like dark water. I polished Frank's silverware, the set his. Mother had given us the year. We married. Until each fork caught the light like a small mirror. I pressed the good tablecloth, the one with the tiny, embroidered flowers I had done myself during the long nights after Frank's death when sleep refused to come. I set 3 places, though I knew in my heart only 2 would ever be the same again. On Saturday, I baked the pie and let the scent fill every corner of the house the way memories fill a mother's chest, sweet, sharp, impossible to ignore. I wrapped it carefully and set it on the counter, like a sleeping child. Sunday morning I woke before dawn, the way I had woken the morning David was born, filled with the same trembling certainty that something irrevocable was about to happen. I dressed in the soft blue, dress I had worn to his college graduation, the one that still fit because grief had kept me thin. I pinned my hair the way Frank liked it, loose at the neck with the silver combs he had bought me on our 30th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who no longer looked away from her own reflection. I placed the thick beige envelope in the exact center of the table. On the front I had written in my neatest handwriting, St. Mary's Senior Assistance Fund, donation records. Inside were not donations. Inside were 8 months of betrayal printed in black and white, circled in red. Where the lies were clearest, I laid a single white rose from the garden on top, because even justice deserves something beautiful. At 5 o'clock, I called David. My voice was warm, steady, the voice he had known all his life. Son, I've missed you. Come to dinner tonight. Bring Clara. I've made your favorites. He sounded tired but pleased, the way he used to sound when I called him home from college for the weekend. He promised they would be there by 6:30. I hung up and felt the house settle around me. Like a held breath, they arrived at 6:28, the silver Lexus gleaming in the last of the daylight like a lie polished to perfection. David stepped out first, carrying another bouquet, this one white lilies, pure and expensive. Clara followed in a jade silk dress that caught the light like water, her hair in soft waves, diamonds flashing at her ears and throat. She smiled that dazzling smile, and for one heartbeat I almost wavered, almost felt sorry for what was coming. Almost. I took the lilies, buried my face in them the way I had buried my face in the roses on Mother's Day, and felt the difference. These smelled only of greenhouse and money. No heart. I led them inside where the table waited, candles flickering in the old glass holders Frank and I had bought on our honeymoon in San Antonio, the scent of ham and cinnamon and fresh bread wrapped around us like a memory none of us could escape. David's eyes lit up the way they used to when he was small and supper was waiting. He hugged me hard, the kind of hug that said he had missed me more than he knew how to say. Clara air-kissed my cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick, and exclaimed over how lovely everything looked, how cozy, how thoughtful. I watched her move through my house the way a cat moves through a room full of sleeping dogs, graceful, alert, certain she owned the place. We ate slowly. I had cooked everything to perfection, and David praised every bite the way he had praised my cooking when he was 10 and thought his mother could do no wrong. Clara picked at her plate, complimented the pie, asked for the recipe as though she had ever turned on an oven in her life. The conversation stayed light. Weather, the new neighbors, David's latest business trip. I smiled and nodded and searched seconds and felt the envelope in the center of the table growing heavier with every passing minute. When the plates were cleared and coffee poured, I reached for the envelope with hands that did not tremble. Before dessert, I said softly, "There's something I'd like to show you both. It's about the Senior Assistance Fund at church. Reverend Cole asked me to go over the donation records, and I thought, you might like to see how generously you've been helping." I slid the first bank statement across the tablecloth toward David. He frowned, curious, and picked it up. The room changed in the space of one heartbeat. I watched his face as he read the recipient. Name Clara Hayes again and again, 8 times $40,000. I watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his eyes widen and then narrow, watched the boy I had raised battle the man he had become for control of his features. Clara's fork clattered against her plate. I did not look at her yet. I kept my eyes on my son, because this moment belonged to him first. One by one, I laid the evidence out like a deck of cards I had been holding close for months, the forged authorization forms, with his signature, the altered ID, the spa receipts, the airline tickets to Cancun, the Lexus financing agreement. Each piece landed softly, but struck like a hammer. David's hands began to shake. The paper rustled like dry leaves. Clara laughed then, a high, brittle sound that shattered against the walls. "It's a mistake," she said quickly. "A bank error. Someone must have." I placed the final document in front of her, the company credit card statement with her personal charges circled in red. $47,800 total. The laughter died in her throat. David looked at her then, really looked, and I saw the exact second his heart broke open. It was the same look he had worn at 7 years old when he realized the tooth fairy was me, wonder turning to betrayal in the space of a breath. He did not shout. Not yet. He simply stared at the woman he had married as though she had become someone he had never met. The candles flickered. The pie sat cooling on. The sideboard untouched. The scent of cinnamon hung in the air like a ghost. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for whatever came next, feeling the strange calm that comes when you have carried a storm inside you for so long that its thunder no longer frightens you. Outside, the first cool wind of autumn rattled the windows, and somewhere in the garden the lavender bowed low, as though the plants themselves understood that everything was about to change. The slam of the screen door that night echoed through the house like a gunshot in a canyon, sharp and final, rattling the windows and sending a tremor through the old floorboards that had held our family together for 43 years. I felt the vibration travel up through my feet, into my legs, into the place behind my ribs where a mother keeps the permanent ache of her children. Clara was gone, her heels striking the porch planks like accusations, the jade silk of her dress catching the last of the candlelight as she fled to the Lexus. The engine roared to life with the same arrogance it had arrived with, tires spitting gravel that pinged against the metal siding like small, angry bullets. Then silence fell, heavier than any sound I had ever known. David did not move to stop her. He sat frozen, In Frank's old chair, the one that had always been his when he came home for Sunday dinner, staring at the scattered papers as though they were the pieces of the life he thought he had built. His face had gone the color of ash, the handsome lines around his eyes suddenly deep and old. I watched the boy I had carried for 9 months fight the man he had become, and the boy was losing. I did not speak. Mothers know there are moments when words are useless, when all you can do is be the still point in the center of the storm you yourself have summoned. The candles had burned low, their flames trembling in the draft from the open door. The scent of honey-glazed ham and cinnamon apple pie hung in the air like a cruel joke. Sweetness turned sour. The white lilies he had brought lay forgotten on the sideboard, already beginning to wilt. I felt every second stretch into eternity, felt the house itself holding its breath the way it had held its breath the night Frank died. David's hands began to shake first, then his shoulders. Then the first sound came, not a sob, not yet, but a low, wounded exhale that carried 38 years of trust shattering all at once. He lowered his head into his hands, fingers threading through hair that had gone from gold to silver far too soon, and the sound that followed was the sound a heart makes when it finally understands it has been living inside a lie. I rose slowly, knees protesting the way they protested everything these days, and moved around the table to stand behind him. I placed my hands on his shoulders the way I had placed them when he was 5 and had fallen off his bicycle when he was 12, and his first girlfriend broke his heart when he was 21, and Frank's casket was lowered into Texas clay. He was too tall now for me to rest my chin on his head, the way I once did, but I felt him lean back into me anyway, the way children lean into mothers, even when they have long since outgrown the need. The tears came then, silent and scalding, soaking the collar of the white shirt that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I felt them through the fabric, hot as shame. I did not tell him it was all right. It was not all right. Nothing about this night would ever be all right again. I cannot say how long we stayed like that, mother and son, surrounded by the ruins of a marriage and the evidence of betrayal spread across the table like a battlefield map. The candles burned themselves out one by one, small deaths in glass holders. The pie cooled, untouched, outside. The wind rose and rattled the windows the way it rattled. The night Frank left me a widow, as though the house itself understood that. Some losses come in waves. Eventually David lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, the eyes of the little boy who had once asked me if daddies ever came back from heaven. He looked at the papers, then at me, then at the empty chair where his wife had sat only minutes ago pretending to be perfect. "She's gone," he whispered, voice raw. "She's really gone." I felt the words land between us like stones in still water. Gone, not just from the house, but from the life he had built, from the future he had imagined. I thought of the wedding day, Clara in white, lace smiling for cameras, while I stood in the background in my simple blue dress, wondering why her eyes never quite warmed when they looked at me. I thought of the way she had rearranged David's house, his schedule, his heart, until there was no room left for the mother who had given him everything. I moved to my own chair and sat, folding my hands the way I folded them in church when the pain got too heavy to carry. Alone. "She took more than money," I said quietly. "She took your trust. And mine." He flinched as though I had struck him. Good. The truth should hurt. It was the only way to burn away the poison. We sat in the dark then, the only light coming from the moon through the kitchen window, silvering the edges of the scattered papers. I watched him pick them up one by one, reading the numbers again, as though repetition might change them. The spa retreats, the jewelry, the flights, to places I had only seen in magazines. $47,800 spent while I learned to make soup from water and whatever the church pantry offered. I felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion that came from loving someone who had forgotten how to love you back. Hours passed. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, then one, then two. David did not move to leave. He sat in the ruins of the evening I had created and let the truth settle into him, layer by layer, the way frost settles on Texas grass in rare winters, beautiful and deadly. At some point I rose and made coffee, strong, and black the way Frank used to make it when the world got too heavy. I set a mug in front of David and watched him wrap his hands around it like a child. He did not drink. I trusted her with everything. He said, finally, voice hoarse, the accounts, the passwords, the house. I thought if I gave her everything, she would never want for anything. I thought that was love. I felt my heart crack a little more, not for myself this time, but for the boy who had learned love from a father who fixed things with his hands and a mother who fixed things with hugs, and had somehow come to believe love meant giving until there was nothing left of yourself. Love isn't measured in what you give away, I said softly. It's measured in what you keep for the people who gave you life. He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw the exact moment the man he had become began to crumble, and the son I had raised began to come home. The night stretched on. We did not speak of lawyers yet, or restitution, or what would happen when the sun came up. We simply sat in the dark with the evidence between us and let the silence do its healing work. Outside, the wind died down, and the stars came out cold and clear the way they had been the night David was born. At 4:30, the sky began to pale in the east. David stood, moving like an old man, and gathered the papers into a neat stack. He placed them back in the beige envelope with hands that still trembled. I'll handle this, he said, voice rough but steady. I'll make it right. I nodded, too tired for words. He bent and kissed my forehead the way he had not done since he was 12, a clumsy, heartfelt kiss that smelled of coffee and tears. Then he walked out into the gray dawn, the screen door closing softly behind him, this time, not with a slam, but with the quiet click of something ending and something else, something harder but truer, beginning. I stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the road that had brought him home so many times before. The air was cool, carrying the first hint of autumn, and the lavender bowed low as though in mourning. I went back inside and blew out the last candle. The house smelled of cold ham and broken dreams. For the first time in 8 months, I did not check the mailbox. There was nothing left to wait for. The long silence had begun, and in that silence, I felt the shape of what came next taking form, slow and inexorable as dawn. 3 dawns after the night, the door slammed. The mail carrier's truck crunched up the gravel at the exact moment the coffee finished perking. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the steam curl against the glass, when I saw the official envelope slide through the slot and land on the mat like a stone dropped into still water. It was thick manila, stamped with the blue seal of the Dallas County Court, and the words confidential, legal documents in letters that looked angry even in print. I did not open it right away. I let it lie there on the faded rug, where generations of welcome mats had worn a path, and I finished pouring my coffee with hands that finally, for the first time in weeks, did not shake. The house was quiet the way only houses that have witnessed a storm can be quiet. Every creak and sigh louder than usual, as though the walls themselves were listening. I carried the mug to the table, sat in Frank's chair, and only then picked up the envelope. It was heavier than paper had any right to be. I turned it over twice, feeling the weight of what was inside the way a soldier feels the weight of a letter from home when he already knows the news is bad. I slid it open with the same letter opener Frank had used for 40 years, the one with the mother-of-pearl handle, his father brought back from the war. Inside were documents crisp and official, words like plaintiff, Margaret and Hayes, and defendant, Clara Elizabeth. Hayes printed in merciless black ink. Elder financial exploitation, fraud, forgery, intent to deceive. The charges marched down the page like soldiers. There was a court date stamped in red, December 12, 2025, less than 3 weeks away. At the bottom, Amelia Rowe, my old college roommate turned warrior, had attached a yellow post-it in her neat, fierce handwriting. We're ready whenever you are. She doesn't get to keep a single penny. Call me. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, steady rush, the way air leaves a tire that has been holding a nail for too long. This was real now, not whispers in a kitchen, not tears in candlelight, not a mother's quiet rage. This was the state of Texas against the woman who had used my name to buy handbags while I learned to live on pride and pantry soup. I laid the papers out on the table the way Bennett had once laid them out, spreading them like tarot cards that told only one future. I read every line twice, 3 times, letting the legal words settle into me the way Scripture settles into a believer. Elder financial exploitation, a crime with a name, with statutes, with punishment. My name, my real name, was on the top of every page, not forged this time, but honored, protected, avenged. I felt something shift inside my chest, something that had been clenched since Mother's Day, finally loosening its grip. This was not vengeance. This was restoration. This was the law doing what a mother's broken heart could not do alone. I spent the rest of the morning reading and rereading until the words blurred. I traced the forged signature on the account, forms with a fingertip that still remembered changing David's diapers, rocking him through fevers, teaching him to tie his shoes. I looked at the photograph on the fake ID, me at 45, smiling the way I smiled before grief, and betrayal had taught me new shapes for my mouth, and felt a surge of something, fierce and maternal and ancient. That afternoon, I called Amelia. She answered on the first ring. It's time, I said, and my voice did not waver. We met at her office downtown, a place of glass and steel that smelled of coffee and justice. Amelia had not changed much since college, still tall, still fierce red hair, now streaked with silver, still the girl who had once stood up to a professor twice her size for calling a widow lazy. She hugged me hard, the kind of hug that says I've got you without wasting words. We sat at a long table covered in more papers, more evidence, more truth than I had ever imagined possible. Bennett was there, too, tie loosened, eyes tired but steady. Reverend Cole had come as well, his presence, a quiet blessing in a room that felt very far from church. Amelia laid it all out like a battle plan. Criminal charges for forgery and theft. Civil, suit for restitution, punitive damages, emotional distress. A restraining order. preventing Clara from coming within 500 feet of me or my accounts. A petition to freeze every asset purchased with the stolen money, the Lexus, the jewelry, the designer wardrobe, until the court decided what belonged to whom. I listened without interrupting, feeling the shape of justice take form the way a potter feels clay finally yielding under patient hands. "We go hard and we go fast," Amelia said. "She'll try to play the victim. She'll cry pretty tears for the judge. She'll say it was a misunderstanding, that she was managing household finances, that you're old and confused. We'll bury her in paper before she ever opens her mouth." Bennett slid a new folder across the table. Inside were bank confirmations, notarized affidavits, even the security footage from the dealership the day Clara took delivery of the Lexus, smiling, signing my forged name without a flicker of guilt. I felt no joy, only a deep, steady calm, the kind that comes when you have carried a burden so long your back has learned a new shape. We worked until the sun set over Dallas, turning the glass walls orange and gold. When we finished, the case was airtight, the kind of case prosecutors dream about, clean numbers, heartbroken, victim, clear villain. Amelia walked me to the elevator and hugged me again. "You're not just getting your money back, Margaret," she whispered. "You're getting your dignity, and no one can put a price on that." I drove home through streets glittering with early Christmas lights, the radio silent because music felt too frivolous for what was inside me. The house welcomed me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the scent of lavender drifting in through the open window. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the court papers spread before me like a map to a country I had never expected to visit. I thought of Clara somewhere out there, perhaps in a hotel suite paid for with my survival, perhaps already packing designer suitcases for a quick escape, and felt not hatred but a vast maternal sorrow. She had been given every chance to be family and had chosen to be a thief. Instead, I thought of David, silent since the night he walked out into the dawn, and felt the ache that only a mother knows when her child is hurting in a place she cannot reach. I thought of Frank, watching from wherever good men go when they leave this earth, and hoped he was proud. The tea grew cold. The moon rose full and white, washing the papers silver. I gathered them carefully, placed them back in the manila envelope, and slid it into the metal box beneath the floorboard, where the love letters and emergency cash used to live. Then I opened my brown leather notebook to a fresh page and wrote a single line in handwriting that finally, after all these months, felt like my own again. The war has a date now, December 12th. Let it come. I closed the book, turned off the light, and for the first time since Mother's Day, I slept without dreaming of empty envelopes and wilted roses. Outside, the Texas night wrapped around the little house like a promise kept. November 22nd, 2025, arrived wrapped in the first real cold of the season, the kind that sneaks under doors and settles in old bones like an unwelcome guest. I woke before the sun, the way I had woken every morning since the night Clara ran, to the sound of the house creaking in the wind and the faint smell of frost on the lavender outside the window. The metal box under the floorboard had become my nightly companion. I no longer needed to open it to feel the weight of the papers inside. They lived in me now, those black and white truths, the way grief once lived in me after Frank died, quiet, constant, impossible to set down. I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and carried it to the porch wrapped in the old quilt my mother had pieced the year I married. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple fading to rose along the edges, and the air tasted clean, sharp the way air tastes when something has been burned away, and what remains is pure for it. The phone rang at 7:14. I knew before I looked at the screen. Only one person called at that hour anymore. David's name glowed like a small wound. I let it ring 4 times, 5, feeling the old habit of rushing to answer my child's call war with the new knowledge that some calls must wait until the caller is ready to speak the truth. On the 6th ring, I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear without speaking. There was only breathing at first, ragged and wet, the sound of a grown man trying not to cry and failing. "Mom," he finally whispered, and the single word carried a lifetime of regret. I closed my eyes and felt the cold bite my cheeks, felt the quilt slip from my shoulders, felt the exact moment my heart decided to open again. "I'm here, son." Another silence, longer this time, filled with the small, wounded sounds of a heart learning how to break properly. "I'm outside," he said at last. "In the driveway. I've been sitting here since 6. I didn't know if you'd want to see me." I looked out past the porch rail, and there was the Tesla silver frost on the windshield, exhaust curling in the cold like smoke from a dying fire. He was just a shadow behind the glass, but I would have known the shape of him anywhere. I did not run. Mothers learn early that running scares wounded things. I set the phone on the railing, walked down the 3 creaking steps in my slippers, and crossed the frost-stiff grass until I stood beside the driver's door. He opened it slowly, as though the smallest sudden movement might shatter him. When he stepped out, I saw what the weeks had done. The expensive suit hung loose on shoulders that had carried too much for too long. His eyes were red-rimmed, the skin beneath them bruised with sleepless nights. The silver at his temples had spread, as though grief itself had painted him older. He looked at me, and the tears finally came, silent and unstoppable, sliding down cheeks that had not known tears since childhood. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom." I opened my arms the way I had opened them the first time he fell off his bicycle, the first time a girl broke his heart, the first time the world taught him it could be cruel. He folded into them like he was still small enough to fit, and I felt his weight settle against me heavier than it had ever been, because now it carried shame along with love. I held him there in the cold dawn while the sky turned from bruise to rose to gold, while the frost melted under our feet, and the lavender bowed low as though in witness. I felt his tears soak through my nightgown, felt his shoulders shake with the kind of sobbing that has no pride left to protect it. I did not shush him. I did not tell him it was all right. I simply held him the way mothers have held broken children since time began, with arms that remember every inch of the body they once carried inside them. When the storm passed, he pulled back, wiping his face with the sleeve of a suit that probably cost more than my car. "I ended it," he said, voice raw. "The marriage, the accounts, everything. She's gone." Took what she could carry and disappeared. Left a note that said I trusted the wrong person. I felt the words land without surprise. I had known she would run the way animals run when they sense the trap closing. "She took more than money," I said quietly. "She took your peace. But peace can be rebuilt. Money cannot buy that." He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw the boy I had raised shining through the ruin of the man he had let himself become. "Can I come home?" he asked, and the question was so small, so humble, it nearly broke me all over again. I took his hand, cold, trembling, The hand that had once held mine crossing streets and learning to write his name, and led him up the steps, across the porch, through the screen door that no longer slammed, but closed softly behind us like forgiveness. I made fresh coffee while he sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he had sat in the night, everything shattered. I did not ask questions yet. There would be time. I simply set a mug in front of him, added 2 sugars the way he had liked since he was 8, and sat across from him with my own. We drank in silence while the sun rose higher and filled the room with light that felt almost holy. Finally he spoke. "I've been staying in a hotel," he said. "Couldn't go back to the house. Everything in it felt poisoned. I sold the Tesla yesterday. Bought a used truck instead. Felt cleaner." I nodded, feeling the shape of his penance and recognizing it because I had worn my own for years. "I froze all the accounts," he continued. "Hired a forensic accountant, someone Bennett recommended. Whatever she took, whatever she spent, I'll pay back twice over if I have to. The court date is December 12th. I'll be there. I'll testify if you need me to." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "I don't need you to testify against her," I said softly. "I need you to testify for yourself, for the man you're going to become now that you know what trust is worth." He turned his hand palm up and held on like a drowning man holds a rope. "I lost everything, Mom." "No," I said, and my voice was steady as Texas. "Clay, you lost the lie. Everything real is still here." We sat like that until the coffee was gone, and the sun was high enough to warm the windows. Then I stood and opened the drawer where I kept the good dishes, took out the brown leather notebook that had become my silent witness, and placed it in front of him. "Read it," I said, "every page. Then you'll understand why I couldn't tell you sooner." He opened it with hands that still trembled and began to read. I watched his face change as he turned the pages. Confusion giving way to horror, horror giving way to grief, grief giving way to something harder and cleaner. When he reached the last entry, he closed the book and laid his head down on it, the way he used to lay his head on my lap when the world was too big. I stood behind him and rested my hands on his shoulders again. "You're home now?" I whispered. "That's enough for today." Outside, the frost had melted completely, and the lavender stood tall again, purple against the winter-brown grass. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was breathing, with us slow and steady and new. The first Saturday David came to the basement of St. Mary's, he arrived at 7:30 in a plain flannel shirt and old jeans, driving a 10-year-old pickup that looked embarrassed to be seen beside the church. He carried 2 boxes of donuts and a shy, broken smile. Reverend Cole met him at the door with the same kindness he showed every wounded soul who walked in. I simply handed David a stack of empty file folders and pointed to the table. No speeches, no explanations, just work. We spent the morning sorting stories. An 82-year-old widow whose son forged her signature on a reverse mortgage, a retired schoolteacher whose granddaughter drained her savings for drugs, a grandfather who woke up to find his pension rerouted to an offshore account by the daughter-in-law he had loved like his own. David read each file slowly, his face aging. With every page, when he came to the one that mirrored our own story, almost exactly, he stopped, fingers trembling on the paper. "This could have been you," he whispered. "It was me," I answered. He looked up, eyes wet, and nodded once. Then he went back to work with the quiet ferocity of a man who finally understands the cost of blindness. By noon he was carrying tables, hanging the hand-painted sign that read Grace Hand's Foundation, helping the forgotten find their voice again, and listening to a 90-year-old woman tell him how her own child had stolen her home. He listened the way I had taught him to listen, when he was small, without interruption, without defense, with his whole heart open. When the last visitor left, he helped me lock up. In the empty basement, he stood among the stacked chairs and empty coffee cups and said the words I had waited months to hear. I want to help pay for this place. Not with stolen money, with mine, whatever it takes. I looked at my son, tired, humbled, real, and felt the last piece of the storm inside me settle. That's between you and God now, son. But you're welcome here every Saturday until you feel whole again. He came every Saturday after that. Sometimes he brought coffee, sometimes tools, sometimes just himself. And slowly, one box, one story, one honest day at a time, he began to rebuild the man I had raised. The morning of the hearing was gray and bitter cold, the sky the color of old pewter. I wore the same navy coat I had worn to Frank's funeral, the one with the moth hole in the sleeve I never bothered to mend. Amelia picked me up at 6. David was already waiting in the courthouse parking lot, hands in the pockets of a plain wool coat, breath fogging in the air. Inside, the hallway smelled of coffee and fear. Clara sat at the defendant's table in severe black, hair pulled back, face pale, but composed. When she saw David standing behind me, something flickered across her features, surprise, then calculation, then the cold mask again. The judge entered. We rose. We sat. Amelia laid out the case like a surgeon, clean, precise, merciless, bank records, forged, signatures, receipts, timelines. Bennett testified calmly, voice steady as Texas clay. I took the stand when called, looked straight at the judge, and told the truth in the same quiet voice I had used to read bedtime stories and say prayers. I did not look at Clara. I did not need to. The truth was doing the looking for me. Her lawyer tried the old age card, the misunderstanding card, the household finances card. Amelia buried him in paper and precedent until he ran out of cards. The judge's gavel fell 3 times, dry and final. Full restitution with interest, permanent, injunction, 6 months mandatory financial counseling. Case closed. Clara stood as they led her away to sign papers. For one heartbeat, our eyes met. I saw no remorse, only fury at being caught. I felt nothing but the vast, clean emptiness that comes when justice has finally spoken. David walked me out into weak winter sunshine. He did not speak until we reached the truck. It's over, he said. No, I answered. It's just beginning. Spring came early that year, the lavender blooming, so thick the air around the little house smelled like forgiveness. Grace Hand's Foundation had outgrown the church basement. We now had a real office downtown with proper desks and a sign that glowed at night. On the evening of the awards ceremony, I wore a simple light blue dress, and the pearls Frank gave me the year David was born. The grand ballroom was full of important people in expensive clothes, but when they called my name, the only face I saw was David's in the front row, eyes shining with the pride I had waited a lifetime to see again. I walked to the podium with steady steps and looked out at the sea of faces. I'm not here to tell you my story. I began, voice soft but carrying to the back of the room. I'm here to tell you, there's the mothers and fathers who love their children with everything they had and woke up one day to find themselves robbed by the very hands they once held. Justice isn't revenge. It's restoration. And sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is stand up and say, "Enough." The applause was long and real. David stood, first tears on his cheeks, and the whole room followed. Later, under a sky full of Texas stars, we stood on the courthouse steps where it had all ended and begun again. He draped his jacket over my shoulders the way Frank used to. "I've never been prouder to be your son," he said. I looked up at the stars and felt Frank smiling, somewhere beyond them. "And I've never been prouder to be your mother." We drove home in his old pickup, windows down, lavender scent, riding the warm spring wind. The little white house waited with its porch light on, the way it had waited every night of David's childhood. Some things, once broken, can never be put back exactly the same, but sometimes they come back stronger, truer, and more full of light than before. And that, more than any award or restitution, check was the real victory,